Okay, now when we ended last week, we had just started looking at the section, chapter 14, 1 through 15, 13. That's a section in which Paul, he makes a plea for peace among the Jewish and Gentile Christians in Rome. There's some tension here, and Paul is making a plea for them to be unified as they need to be. And I provided some background explanation of what's behind that tension. And then I quoted Colin Kruse in his commentary. He says, the most widely accepted view, and that adopted in this commentary, is that the weak are Jewish Christians, including possibly proselytes, Gentiles who had converted to Judaism, who practiced essentially Jewish customs, and the strong were mainly Gentile Christians, including some Jewish believers who were liberated, like Paul himself, who felt no obligation to practice these customs. I think that's right. That's in accord with what I explained is the background and what's going on there. And we had just started looking at chapter 14, verses 1 to 12, when I was cut off by the bell. That bell, man, that thing is something. But let me repeat what I said about verse 1, and then we'll go on from there. So in verse 1, Paul tells the Gentile majority. So you know this is Jewish and Gentile, but there's a Gentile majority in the church. And he tells the Gentile majority that they are to welcome or receive those who are weak in faith, meaning the Jewish Christian who is weak in his grasp of the implications of the faith, who has underdeveloped convictions about what the faith allows, about what is permissible under the new covenant. And these weak Christians that he says you are to receive them and welcome them, included in that, you see, they're not to be merely to be tolerated, right? But they are to be accepted into the family of God. They're not to be mocked or disparaged for their convictions, as that would make them feel like outsiders, right? They wouldn't feel like they were part of the community. Moreover, they're to be accepted with the right motivation and spirit. You see, they're not to be received provisionally for the purpose of quarreling with them about their misguided convictions. This idea of, you're kind of on the outs, but you're temporarily, we'll let you get close enough to us so we can straighten you out. You see, they're not to be received that way. Now, that doesn't mean that teaching them is forbidden. It clearly is not. It doesn't mean that. It means that they're not to be received with an ulterior motive of setting them straight. They're not to be given a kind of probationary reception, so that they're not really part. They're just hanging around till you can fix them. Okay, that's not what he's talking about. Now, then he says in verses 2 to 4, that those whose faith is strong enough to eat meat, so that's the Gentile majority. You see, you've got these Jews who are abstaining from eating meat because of their continuing conviction that somehow that's not right. So he says here that those whose faith is strong enough to eat meat, they are not to have a disdainful or a condescending attitude toward the law-observing Jewish minority, but then neither is that Jewish minority to judge those, to condemn those who eat meat. He says, for God has welcomed the meat eater. So you're not to be looking down on them and judging them, because God has welcomed them. And since God accepts the meat eaters, then so must the Jewish Christians. I mean, after all, he says it's the Lord's judgment of his servant that matters. That's the relevant judgment. And if the Lord receives the meat eater, then who are you not to receive the meat eater? All right, so this is his message to them. And the meat eater will stand in the Lord's approval, and he will stand because meat eating is not wrong. It was part of the old covenant, the Mosaic law that has been transcended, has been fulfilled, has been rendered obsolete. So he will stand in the Lord's approval because his eating meat, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, as I've said, the Jewish and Gentile Christians, they differed in their observance of holy days, right? The Jews had a calendar, the Sabbath day in particular, every Sabbath. But they also had other holy days. They differed with regard to these holy days and in eating meat. And so in verses 5 and 6, Paul notes that the scrupulous Jew, this sensitive Jew, he considered certain days, especially the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. That was a very important marker of Jewish distinctiveness. He considered certain days, you see, as distinctively holy, distinctively sacred, whereas the Gentile believer didn't do that. He considered all days equal in holiness. No day of the week was uniquely sacred. And the scrupulous Jew, he also considered it wrong, or at least inferior, or less pious, to eat meat or to drink wine that might be ritually unclean. In other words, something that was contrary to the food laws of the Old Covenant, or the wine that he thought may have been used in a sacrifice or something. So he thinks that it's somehow inferior or less pious for them to do that. And Paul says that either practice is acceptable. The Jewish Christians who are continuing to honor the Sabbath and view it that way, and who are abstaining from meat, and the Gentile Christian who considers all the days equally holy and is eating meat, he says that either of those practices is acceptable as long as it's done with a clear conscience, as long as each is fully convinced in his own mind that the conduct is acceptable to God. Okay, that's important to what Paul is going to be saying. As long as you're clear in your own mind that it's acceptable, then it's acceptable. Now, it's crucial to understand, right, that the practices of both the strong and the weak that he's talking about here, they are acceptable to God because neither is sinful. Neither is contrary to God's will. See, the Jew who observed these holy days and abstained from meat and wine because he erroneously, mistakenly, but sincerely believes it's God's will to do so, well, that person is doing more than God requires. Right? That person is then voluntarily restricting his freedom that he has. So that's not wrong. He's doing more than God requires. And the one who correctly understands that the food laws and the sacred days of the Mosaic law, that those are not binding, well, that person is doing right because he is enjoying the freedom that he has in the Lord. So the one is doing more than the Lord requires. That's not wrong. And the other one is enjoying his freedom in the Lord. You see, these things that he's talking about, they are like circumcision. Right? We understand they're like circumcision. It is not sinful to do them or to abstain from doing them. Neither is sinful, right? It's not sinful to get circumcised. It's not sinful not to get circumcised. Well, that's how these are. You see, so that's important to understand. Now, when something is sinful, when something is contrary to the will of God, it doesn't become acceptable simply because the one doing it thinks it's not sinful. Right? I mean, ignorance doesn't baptize sin. No, I think it's fine. No, you see, it's only in these matters that are morally neutral, you see, where one's conscience is the guide. You may recall when we went through 1 Corinthians, at least I hope you do, that some in Corinth, right, they were justifying eating the sacrificial food at the cultic meals in the pagan temples. Paul had said, no, you can't do that. And they pushed back on Paul. And they were arguing that, no, it was okay for us to do that. They were convinced it was fine. And in fact, they even argued for the practice in the name of knowledge. Like they said, look, we all understand that there's only one God, but one of these pagan deities not really gods. So this is just a social thing. What are you talking about? Okay, so they were saying that this was right and this was proper for us to do, and Paul would have none of it. Right? Paul would have none of it. You see in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 to 13, and chapter 10, verses 14 to 22. You see, it's only when something is a matter of indifference to God, only when something is morally neutral, that one's conscience in that case then becomes the controlling guide. In the case of morally neutral matters, right, if one thinks it's wrong, then for that person it is wrong. Even though objectively it is a matter of indifference to God, it is morally neutral, but if you think it is wrong, you mistakenly, erroneously believe it is wrong, then for you to do it is wrong. Right? It is then contrary to your conscience. Now, of course, the scrupulous Jew here, this Jew believes at some level that what he's dealing here with is a matter of God's will, and that's why his conscience is disturbed by it. But in this case, we know for a fact that the scrupulous Jew is wrong. Right? We know that for a fact. Paul makes that clear, that the idea that eating certain meat is somehow contrary to the will of God, you see, or not observing these holy days is somehow contrary to the will of God. The Jew is mistaken in thinking that. We know that because the Spirit, through Paul, makes that clear implicitly, and he makes it clear explicitly. He makes it clear implicitly by labeling the Jews weak in faith, and by the fact he leaves it as a matter of conscience. If this is a matter of God's will, that it is sinful for you to eat meat as it was under the Mosaic covenant, well, do you think he's going to turn to the Gentiles and say, no, go ahead and eat? Just go ahead and eat. Yeah, God doesn't want you to do it, but it's fine. No. You see, so the fact he labels them weak in faith and he leaves it as a matter of their consciences, you see, that implicitly says that the Jew is wrong in believing that there is something wrong with eating meat or not observing those holy days. But he also makes that point explicitly in verses 14 and again in verse 20. Now the Jewish Christian, right? The Jewish Christian hears these things. He hears these things, has no doubt heard them before. He may hear contrary voices. But the point is, despite hearing these things, he hasn't yet internalized that truth. The Jew hasn't internalized that truth so as to be free in his heart from the conditioning of his upbringing. That's what's important to understand. He does not yet have the consent of his conscience to engage in the practice. Even though the practice is morally neutral, it is not wrong. This Jew doesn't have the consent of his conscience to do that. And that's what's motivating him. And then Paul says in verses 7 to 9 that the Christian must follow his conscience because he or she lives to please the Lord. Right? Not to please fellow believers. We are the Lord's from start to finish. And every aspect of our lives, even our death, is under his lordship. Everything is under his lordship. So Christ's lordship is so total that it includes both the dead and the living. And so this is why you have to respect your conscience. And he says in verses 10 and 12, he explains that refusing to accept one another, Jews and Gentiles kind of pulling back from each other because of these disagreements, refusing to accept one another because of disputes over matters of indifference to God is absurd. You see, in light of the fact we will each answer to God not only for our practices, but also for our refusal to receive one another. So he says that's absurd. All right, now, when you look at in what Paul says about holy days, I'm going to give you an excursus, a long footnote, okay, on holy days. So keep your place where we are. This isn't Paul's concern, but it comes up when we see what he's saying about holy days. It raises for us a number of questions, so I want to talk about those. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. Paul's indication here in chapter 14, verse 5, when he says that the observance of holy days is a matter of indifference to God. One of the questions that comes up, you say, well, is Paul then denying that Sunday is an appointed day for Christians to gather for corporate worship? By saying that there aren't these holy days, they're a matter of indifference, is Paul saying, therefore, that there's something wrong if you have Sunday as an appointed day, a divinely appointed day for gathering for Christian worship? I don't think Paul is saying that at all. Okay, I don't think Paul is saying that. After all, Sunday, the Spirit of God reveals to us that Sunday, it's called the Lord's Day. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, right, which shows that title of Sunday as the Lord's Day shows that it is in some way distinct from other days, right? It's the Lord's Day, they're not. So you already see there's some understood distinction about Sunday. And David Allen, who's a very well-known New Testament scholar, he wrote a 3-volume commentary on the Greek text of Revelation. David Allen says in his commentary, he says, Kyriake Hemera, which is the phrase Lord's Day, in Revelation 1:10 is widely understood to be a new Christian designation for Sunday. Because sometimes people say, well, is the Lord's Day there Sunday? Yes, the Lord's Day is Sunday. Okay? People understand that. This isn't some trick. This isn't some preacher talk. This is, in fact, well understood historically that this is the meaning of Lord's Day there. And it's the day that belongs to the Lord in the sense it is the day on which His people assemble to specially commemorate His death and resurrection by sharing in the memorial that He prescribed. In fact, that adjective, okay, you see Lord's Day, this adjective Kyriake, well, it's the adjective Kyriakos. And that word, that adjective appears only 2 times in the New Testament. Only 2 times, right? Once it appears in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 20, in the phrase Lord's Supper. The only other time it appears is here in the phrase Lord's Day. And that has led a number of scholars to conclude, well, that the title Lord's Day reflects that day's connection with the Lord's Supper. For example, there's a German scholar, a guy named Willi Rohrdorf, who wrote and had an extensive study, wrote a book on Sunday in the early church. And Rohrdorf concluded in that study, he said, it is probable that the title Kyriake Hemera, Lord's Day, is derived from the designation Kyriakon Deipnon, Lord's Supper. In other words, it seems probable that the whole day on which this Lord's Supper took place received the title Lord's Day. And of course, you know that in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, we see there that Paul, he tells the Galatian churches and the Corinthians to set aside a sum of money for his collection for the poor saints in Jerusalem on the first day of each week. Okay, which most scholars recognize that in the words of the significance of that, in the words of the German scholar Hans Conzelmann, they recognize that by that Paul indicates, you see, that Sunday is already, by the time he's writing 1 Corinthians in the mid-50s, it's already the day of meeting. And you see this again in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, where it says that the saints, they gathered together on the first day of the week, Sunday, Sunday specifically to take the Lord's Supper. He says to break bread, their meaning to take the Lord's Supper. David Allen, he says here in Acts 20 verse 7, the phrase to gather together is a technical term referring to the assembly of Christians for worship. And numerous scholars recognize that this verse refers to a Christian worship assembly. This isn't a secret. It's not some sneaky thing from the Church of Christ. Okay? They recognize this. In the paper I have online titled Observing the Lord's Supper Each Lord's Day, I list more than a dozen scholars who recognize this. And then the phrase to break bread, you see we're to gather together, where he says it's a technical term here referring to the assembly of Christians for worship. They gather together to break bread, and that phrase in Acts 27 to break bread is widely understood to be a reference to the Lord's Supper. Now you have to, no, it's not. No, it's widely understood that way. There's nothing like, it's not like over here you're trying to be sneaky or you have an agenda. No, I'm not the only one who sees this. You see, it's widely understood. For example, that phrase, breaking bread, means the Lord's Supper. And you can see it that way in Luke 22:19. You see that breaking bread having that indication in Acts 2:42, 1 Corinthians 10:16. That's what it means in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Richard Longnecker, he says they met, Luke tells us, Luke is the author of Acts, they met, Luke tells us, to break bread. Which especially after Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 10, 16, and 17, and 11, 17 to 34, must surely mean to celebrate the Lord's Supper. It's not, he's saying like it's, come on, right? You have to understand that's what is meant by that phrase there. Rohrdorf, in his study, he says, surely the breaking of bread in Acts 27, nothing else than the Lord's Supper is meant. Okay, so here you have these people saying, look, this is as plain as the nose on Ashby's face, right? I mean, this is something that it's pretty clear. John Lansma, another New Testament scholar, he writes in the Dictionary of the Later New Testament and its Developments, there is a dictionary on that. He writes, Lansma says, we have to do then with a formal gathering of the church on the first day of the week, the stated purpose of which is to celebrate the Lord's Supper rather than to say farewell to Paul. Right? In fact, Paul was in a hurry. In Acts 20, where we have this meeting, Paul was in a hurry to reach Jerusalem by the time of the Pentecost. And we see that, right? He tells us that in Acts 20, verse 16. So we know he's hustling, and, travel then wasn't, our travel's not great, but travel then was a lot dicier than it is now. So he's hustling to get there. We know that from what he says. And yet he waits in Troas 7 days until the church is gathering on Sunday, and then he leaves the next morning. So he's in a hurry to get there, but he waits 7 days until this assembly where they're there taking the Lord's Supper. And that indicates, doesn't it, that their time of gathering for worship here was already a fixed day? Because Paul wants to share with them in this worship assembly and the taking of the Lord's Supper, and they don't even contemplate, well, that's all right, we'll just make it Thursday. Right? We'll accommodate your schedule. You're in a hurry. He's going to wait. He waits 7 days because that's when the church meets. You see, that's when the church meets. Gordon Fee, well-known, he's dead now, but a very well-known New Testament commentator. He says, Luke's account in Acts chapter 20 implies most strongly that Paul and the others waited in Troas until the first day of the week precisely because that is when the Christians gathered for the breaking of bread, that is, their meal in honor of the Lord. Andrew Lincoln, he says, the narrative with its talk of staying for 7 days in Troas and Paul's intention to depart the next morning reads as though Paul deliberately planned to address all the believers when they assembled for their weekly meeting. Okay, and then you look, you say, okay, so this is what I'm picking up as I study and read and reflect on the New Testament. It is saying to me that the first day of the week is the time when the Christian community gathered. And so then you go and you look and say, well, how does that understanding play out in church history? Does church history corroborate that understanding? Does it confirm that understanding? Or does it challenge that understanding? Okay? So that's the function of church history. It is obviously not inspired, but you use it to see, am I tracking correctly? Right? Sometimes there'll be disagreements in early church history, okay. What you don't want to have is some conviction that you find everybody in the early church contradicts. Okay? Because that would maybe make you need to go back. You could be right, but you would then have to go back and say, if I am right, how is it that all of these people so early came to a different conclusion than I've come to? All right, so that's how you use church history, and that's how it functions. But in the early church history, it corroborates this picture. You see that the practice of the apostolic church was to observe the Lord's Supper each Lord's Day. For example, the Didache. The Didache is a document, it is a manual on church life that dates from the late 1st to the early 2nd century. So in the 90s, to maybe 110, something like that. It is thought to have arisen in either Syria or Egypt. And it says, having earlier confessed your sins, so that your sacrifice may be pure, come together each Lord's day of the Lord, break bread, and give thanks. Come together, each Lord's day of the Lord, and break bread. Now, if you're like most people, you're going, well, that's an interesting double expression, Lord's Day of the Lord. What's going on with that? And the renowned church historian, Everett Ferguson, he comments on that, and I think this is right. He says, perhaps the simplest explanation of that double expression, Lord's Day of the Lord, that you see in the Didache, he says, perhaps the simplest explanation is to see the phrase as a counterpart to the Old Testament and Jewish phrase, the Sabbath of the Lord, meaning the Sabbath is the Lord's. Kyriake would already have been for the author the name of a particular day of the week. The first day of the week, Sunday, Lord's Day. You see, it belongs to the Lord, Christ, now and not God, as well as bearing his name. It is the Lord's Day of the Lord. It is the Sunday that belongs to the Lord. As he puts it, it is the Lord's Sunday, or the lordly day of the Lord. But in any event, it is the first day of the week when the Christians are gathering together for the purpose of sharing in the supper. Then Pliny was a Roman governor who was a governor of a province, Bithynia. And in early 2nd century, he writes a letter to the Roman emperor. The emperor at that time was Trajan. And he writes to Trajan, and he has a problem. He's got these Christians. He's wanting to know, how do I deal with these people? Okay, how do I deal with them? And he takes some and he tortures them and gets information for what they're doing. So in what he writes in AD 112, okay, see how early this is. I mean, Revelation's like 95, maybe, 95. This is 112. And we have his letter. We have the letter that he wrote to the emperor after having examined these Christians. And he says, in part, he writes and he says, they, the Christians, asserted that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day. They met on a fixed day. Okay, so it wasn't like, hey, we just freeform it. No, they met on the Lord's Day. And he says, before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr you can tell who he is from his name, right? Justin Martyr was scourged and he was beheaded for his faith. And he wrote in the middle of the 2nd century, so around 150, as part of a defense he was making for Christianity. Justin writes, he says, "And on the day called Sunday, there is a gathering together in the same place of all who live in a city or a rural district. The memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Then when the reader ceases, the president in a discourse admonishes and urges the imitation of these good things." It's like a sermon. "Next, we all rise together and send up prayers. And as I said before, when we cease from our prayer, bread is presented and wine and water." They diluted the wine. That was standard, you see, so you weren't slugging the stuff. He says, "The president in the same manner sends up prayers and thanksgiving according to his ability, and the people sing out their assent, saying the amen. A distribution and participation of the elements for which thanks have been given is made to each person. And to those who are not present, it is sent by deacons." All right. So you see these kinds of things. So what I read from the New Testament, I go back and say, well, is this consistent with early church? Yes. It just flows right into it. So here's what Rohrdorf, he concluded from his study of Sunday in the early church. He says, in the ancient church, it was unthinkable for a Sunday to pass without the local church gathering for a celebration of the Lord's Supper. Sunday was absolutely nothing without the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper formed the focal point of the worship around which all the other parts of the service found their place. And Ferguson, as I said, he was a renowned church historian, studied church history at Harvard. He was the editor of the Encyclopedia of Early Christianity. He was a professor of church history at Abilene Christian University for a long time. He's internationally renowned church historian. Well, he reached the following conclusion regarding the early church's observance of the Lord's Supper. He said, texts from early Christian literature stress that Christians observe the first day because it is the day of the resurrection. They observe the day with an assembly, and in that assembly they take the supper. The testimony of church history shows that we have not misread the New Testament in concluding that the Lord's Supper was observed each Sunday. The apostolic practice was a weekly communion on the first day of the week. If this was not the apostolic practice, well, then one has the difficult job of explaining how all the churches came to adopt the same custom. The conclusion to be drawn is that Acts chapter 20, verse 7 is not an accidental reference, but reflects the general practice of New Testament churches. And I think that's right. And so, if you're with me, so this is what is going on. This is the understanding. This is the historical context. Well, in that historical context, well, then the command in Hebrews chapter 10:25 not to neglect or abandon our own assembly, the Christian assembly. Well, that is first and foremost. That is a command. That's a command not to cease attending the Lord's Day gathering at which the Lord's Supper was shared. You see, that was the central and paramount Christian assembly. So this is what the Spirit is saying there. Now, what Paul is saying in Romans is that under the new covenant, the Jewish practice of considering certain days as distinctively holy. You see, holy, like the weekly Sabbath. Well, that is a matter of indifference to God. No day is holier than another in the new covenant. Rather, all days are equally holy, so there is no obligation. There is no obligation to observe the Sabbath or to observe other Jewish holy days. You see that same truth reflected in Galatians chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, and Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Now, that the Lord's Day is an appointed day of Christian worship does not mean that it is a more sacred day, that it is a distinctively holy day in the sense that the Sabbath was a holy day. Now, I realize we have people who think that, look, they think that Sunday is simply a Christianized version of the Jewish Sabbath. The day just moved. You see, the day, it's the same thing as the Jewish Sabbath, but no, it's not. You see, it's not that way. You see, it's Andrew Lincoln. Let me read you what Andrew Lincoln says about it, and I think this makes sense. I hope it helps you. He says, the Lord's Day need not be understood in terms of a sacred day. The day can be said to be the Lord's because it is the appropriate day for worshiping Him, and this is significantly different from the view that sees the day by analogy with the Jewish Sabbath as a full 24-hour period belonging to the Lord in a distinct way from that in which all the Christians' time belongs to the Lord. Whereas the latter is in conflict with the sentiment approved in Romans 14:5. In other words, if you're going to look at the Sabbath and say, no, it isn't. The Lord's Day today is a distinctively holy day, and it's just like the Jewish Sabbath. Well, then you've got an issue with what Paul is saying. Right? Because Paul is saying it's a matter of indifference. But he says the former, where you understand that it's a day of meeting, it's an appointed day of meeting. It is not a distinctively holy day in the same way the Sabbath was a holy day. Well, then you don't have a problem with what Paul says. Lincoln goes on, he says, there's a sense in which all of life should be a prayer, and yet a recognition of this doesn't detract from the need for specific prayer at specific times. Similarly, the notion that all of one's time is devoted to the Lord does not detract from the necessity of specific worship at specific times. To claim that specifically Sunday is the appropriate day for a gathering of the Christian community for worship is not to imply that somehow in itself that day is holy. Okay, that's the distinction I think that is legit, and I think that's how to put these things together. That is why I went through all this, because when you read that, you wind up saying, well, it doesn't matter. Who cares when we meet? Right? Doesn't matter. Right? Doesn't matter. But I'm trying to get you to see I think that's a mistake. You see, and people say, well, you're just a traditionalist. No, I don't come by these things that way. You see? Now, you can say, I think you're wrong. All right, that's fair. You know, we have to go hash through it and look at it. But this idea of just saying, well, you just think that's because it's true. Well, first, that's slightly insulting. You see? It's slightly insulting to say, well, you know, you didn't come at this because you thought about it and studied it and are actually convinced that this is true. You're just parroting stuff because you were raised in the Church of Christ. One, I wasn't raised in the Church of Christ. Right? I was a wild man. Somebody said was, I heard that. But that was, but I came to Christ as an adult. So I don't think Paul is denying that Sunday's an appointed day for Christians to gather for corporate worship. I don't think that at all. I don't think how that's even possible. If he was going to do that, he would have had to bring a bigger gun. You know, he couldn't just do this saying that. Given all this that I'm saying, he'd had to take more time to unpack that. So I don't think he's doing that at all, nor do I think Paul is saying that Christians are free to make up their own holy days and observe them. Okay, hey, we need another holy day. Why don't we just create one and then we'll observe it? I don't think Paul is saying that at all. See, the holy days Paul is talking about, those holy days, you see, those that some of the Jewish Christians were continuing to observe, the Sabbath and other Jewish holy days. Those holy days had been prescribed by God in the Old Testament, right? It's one thing for the Jew who had been trained in the law all of his life to feel that observing those divinely prescribed days, that was somehow an honor to God. It is another thing to feel that days never appointed, never sanctioned by God, that they can be declared holy by human will and then be observed and honored him. You see, that's a completely different thing. We are not in the same position as those Jews whose consciences, you see, their consciences were caught in the salvation historical shift that had occurred with the coming of Christ. That's what happened. You see, they had been raised all their lives in the old covenant, and now here comes Christ, and he brings the new covenant. So they're caught in this shift. They're not parallel to somebody who just comes and says, hey, you know what? My birthday's a good day. Why don't we make that a holy day and we get everybody to come together? And all right, do you see the difference? And so that's something I think is important. So I have a minute to go, and I now back to Romans. All right, that was that. All of that stuff I went through. That's not Paul's concern, but I wanted to address it because I know the kinds of thoughts that come up. And this one comes up fairly often, so maybe more than you cared to hear on all that. But there you have it. 14:13, I got a minute 27. We'll see what we can do. He says, do I even want to read this? I think I'd rather read it next week because I'm going to have to repeat it. I'll get through this and start talking. The bell will ring. So how about I give you a minute and 15 seconds? It's free time. Okay? Free time. You guys do whatever you want. Thanks. I was a wild man.